You know, we can relate to this title, What God Can Do When Things Go Wrong, because all of us, have days like that. That's from the movie Alexander, the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Really Bad Day. And it's a book based on a book by Judith Fiorst that Melissa and I used to read to our children. And in the movie, it's the story of a 12-year-old boy who everything seems to go wrong in his life, and his family around him are just, things just seem charmed in their life. The parents are in careers that are on the upswing, and the brother is the prom king, dating the prettiest girl in high school. The sister is the lead in the school play, and then there's Alexander, that everything goes wrong. So for his 12th birthday, he makes a wish that they would experience a day like his, and they do. It's a great movie. Do you ever feel like Alexander? Or maybe like Wile E. Coyote, that you're the Alexander or the Wile E. Coyote of your friend group. If something's going to go wrong, you know Murphy was not kidding. What can go wrong will go wrong, and it'll happen to you. I know what that's like. Probably all of us have experienced days like that. When I was starting my career with AT&T, I made a friend who was kind of our Wile E. Coyote of our group. His name was Paul, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind me telling this story because he had story after story of days like this. My favorite story is a Christmas story. It was Christmas Eve. We had just finished work. He was going to go by the mall to get that one last gift for his son. And it started snowing. It was going to be one of those white Christmases, and it was a typical Middle Tennessee snow. A lot of snow, a little bit of ice, just enough to make things really, really nasty and uncomfortable. He gets to the mall, gets out of his car, goes in, gets the gift, and he comes back out, goes to his car, puts his key in the door lock to unlock his car, and the key will not turn. Lock's frozen. So he was a smoker. He pulls out his lighter and he starts putting the lighter to the fire to that lock. And the plastic coating on the outside of that key lock started melting and going into the lock. And so now he can't get his key in the lock. And so he sees somebody coming by. They had just bought clothing, and he asks them to borrow or to use a wire hanger that their clothes were hanging on. They give him the wire hanger. He starts fishing in the window to try and unlock the door. He can't get it done because it's one of those locks that's inside the little handle. And so finally he turns around, and he had parked beside one of those big planters, this bay, and there was a huge rock in there. And he picks up the rock and he bashes in the window of the car. And he unlocks the door. He gets in, sits down, looks out the windshield, and sees the most horrible sight he's ever seen. 2 rows over sits his car. Now, dude, I can't make that stuff up. Now, that is a terrible, horrible, no good, really bad day. You know, we all have them, whether it's the mundane things like trying to get to work on time and every red light catching you. You've been there. Or maybe you're a parent of a teenager and for some reason your gas tank's always on empty, right? Or, you know, you just never know. Maybe the waiter ignores you when you go out to eat, or she says you look 60. Could be that. Or it could be something monumental. It could be when the doctor says, yeah, you're sick, and you're going to be sick a long, long time. Or maybe your teenager has screamed before they ran away, I hate you. Or maybe a spouse comes home one day and says, you know what, I'm over it, I'm done, I'm out of here. And to add insult to injury, they say something horrible like, you know, I don't think I ever really loved you. Too much has happened. And whether it's mundane or monumental, everyone has one of those days where you feel like life isn't fair and the deck has been stacked against you. And today's title is appropriate because everyone needs to know that they can endure hard times. And it's when we're at our darkest that God's light has a way of shining its brightest. And we can see Him in the darkness that is all around us. So if you struggle, and if you're someone who questions, doubts, frustrated, I want to tell a story today, a story from Scripture that I hope helps you. It's a unique story. It's a story of a miracle that Jesus performs. And to set this up, I want to tell you about something I came across while I was doing research on this story. It was an article about an event that happened out west. It was something called Comic-Con, and I don't know if you know what Comic-Con is or not, but Comic-Con is where comic book enthusiasts have a convention, and they come to the convention dressed as the characters in the comic books. And I accidentally I was at the convention center for a different event and actually wandered into a Comic-Con event. It was enlightening. It truly, and I'm not making fun of these people. If you're one of those Comic-Con folks, hey man, fly your flag. At least you got the courage to be who you are. Most people don't. As long as it's not illegal or immoral, man, have fun. But man, I've never seen anything like this. Well, at this particular Comic-Con, they did a survey. And in the survey, they asked this: if you really were a superhero and you had a superpower, what would your superpower be? That's a good question, right? And the answers they got back, some of them were very typical, like superhuman strength or superhuman speed, or they wanted to be able to fly, X-ray vision, be able to read people's thoughts, but some of them were unique. One of the ones that didn't make the top 10, I thought was kind of interesting, and he mentioned it in the article. They considered empathy a superpower. You know, the ability to feel other people's pain and to bear that burden with them. But the one that came in number 10 was one of Jesus' miracles. It wasn't raising people from the dead. It wasn't healing the blind, lame, crippled. It wasn't knowing what people were thinking. Coming in at number 10 was the superpower of changing water into wine. And I dare say there are people in this room that wish they had that superpower. And that's what this story is about. It's about a story of wedding, Cana of Galilee, and Jesus' very first public miracle. So let's read this story together. In John chapter 2, the first 11 verses, it goes like this. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. And the mother of Jesus was there, and both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. I find this interesting because you know why Jesus was invited to the wedding? Because people liked him and they wanted him there. More than likely, this was his family. And when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now, there were 6 stone water pots, and they're set there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." So they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now and take it to the head waiter." So they took it to him. And when the head waiter tasted the water that had become wine, and did not know where it had come from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called to the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man serves the good wine first. And when people have drunk freely, then he serves the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of his signs Jesus did at Cana of Galilee and maintained and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. Kind of a long story, interesting story. It's the story of an everyday average event, but it was a joyous event. It was a major event. It was a wedding. And like every other wedding, it had its drama. I've been a part of tons of weddings, and the first thing I tell a bride and groom when they ask me to do their wedding is something on that day is going to happen you're not going to expect. And at the moment, it's going to seem like a tragedy, but you're going to look back on it and laugh. And in my Melissa's wedding, the minister and my best man were standing in a room off to the side in the dark because it was appropriate for the lighting of the wedding, of course. And all of a sudden we heard ping, 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 ping. And the best man had dropped Melissa's wedding band. Oh, it was tiny, it was thin, and her fingers are tiny and thin as well. And all 3 of us were on the ground in the dark trying to find that. You know, weddings always have drama. Whether it's the wedding where the wedding planner thinks that mom and dad's budget is really just a suggestion, or the problem where you have the outdoor wedding. Anybody done that? Where you're not sure if it's going to rain or it's going to be too hot. Are you going to soak or are you going to sweat? What's going to happen? And Aunt Gertie's not going to be happy if it's too hot. Or maybe it's just the drama of the parents. The groom's parents and the bride's parents don't get along, and the bride begs Dad, Dad, please don't embarrass me today. There's always drama in a wedding. And being a father whose daughter is about to go through a wedding, I just want to tell you this. Paying for a wedding can be dramatic as well. There's a reason that fiance and finance are spelled so similarly. If you have a little girl, parents that have small children, and she wants to be a princess one day in her wedding, I suggest when she turns 10, start saving 2% of your income, or rob a bank, whichever one you want to do. That's kind of the way it works with weddings. In this wedding, the service was great, and the party had been going for a while. You know, in verse 1, it says on the third day. A lot of people think, the third day, that's an odd day to have a wedding. That's Tuesday. No. This was the third day of the reception, because at Jewish weddings, they had the service, and then for 7 days they partied. It was the third day of the wedding when they started to run out of wine. Now, with every wedding back then, and they had the long celebrations, I have to tell you that a 7-day reception is more than I would be able to bear. Being an introvert, 7 days of peopling is more than I could stand. But for the Jewish people, this was something they considered common. It was a celebration, a joyous event. Well, they had a person at every one of these weddings, and in this translation, it calls him the head waiter. So some other translations call him something different. He had one job, and here's what his job was. He was kind of like the wedding coordinator, but he would want to make sure that they did not run out of supplies for this 7-day party. And wine was one of the supplies. And in order to do this, what they did is at a wedding feast, the wine was 2 parts wine, 1 part water, and that's how it started. And the longer the wedding feast went, they would add more water to the wine so that they wouldn't run out. And it was his job to make sure they didn't run out. Now, they added water to the wine for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was so that it would stretch further. You know, if my daughter wants lemonade, start running out, we'll just throw some water in with the lemons, right? But the other reason was so they didn't get so intoxicated that they stopped having fun and started being weird. And so it was his job to make sure this was happening, and now it's the third day, and they're just about to slap out. Now, Mary understands this problem. And the reason she understands this problem, the reason she's so empathetic, is more than likely this is her family that is part of this wedding feast. And to run out of supplies, any supply, especially wine, in this particular case, was, well, let's just say it was a social faux pas. These people would be humiliated. They would be embarrassed. It would be a social suicide to run out of this at the wedding. And so she turns to her son and she says, hey, do something. She doesn't tell him what to do, but he says something that's kind of unique, and that's why I highlighted it in the text. He turns to her and says, what does this have to do with us? My time has not yet come. Now, he's standing at a wedding. Nothing tragic's happening. And he turns to her and he says, my time has not yet come. Now, John uses this phrase several times in his text. Other Gospels use it as well. Every time Jesus says, my time has not yet come, what he's talking about is the cross. He's talking about this road to Calvary, and he knows in this particular case, since there had been no miracles yet, no public miracles, to do this would begin his road to Calvary. That nothing after this would ever be the same. There would be no incognito Jesus anymore. And he was on a collision course with the cross. And so he looks at his mom and he says, my time hasn't yet come. And so her response is to the servant standing around, whatever he says for you to do, you do it. This is up to him. And what happens next tells us this, that Jesus loves showing up in the mundane as well as the monumental. We don't have to have tragedy in our lives in order for him to care and him to arrive and for him to show up. Whether it's mundane or monumental, you will see him move. How many of you have ever been out on a limb in your life and you knew if he doesn't come through, I'm through, and somewhere along the line when you look back on how you made it through that journey, you can see how he worked. Now, I'm not promising that to believe in Jesus and to do what he says means that that scan's going to come back clear. Or that you're going to get your job back, or that the money will arrive on time, or your spouse will come home. I'm not saying any of those things because those things may not happen. But I will say that no matter what valley you're going through, that if we can understand and we will tune in, we'll see that Jesus shows up in the most ordinary circumstances. And we can see him working in our lives, but we just have to wait for it. And we just have to be tuned into it. Isaiah says it this way in Isaiah 40:31, yet those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not grow faint. They will walk and not become weary. If we wait on the Lord in the middle of our storms and in the middle of this darkest moment, his light shines the brightest, and what we'll find is we'll find this: he's there. And there'll be strength in that. So, with this story, I want to give you a couple of ideas, a couple of points, and then take it home and it's yours. First point's this: Jesus can do better than we can in ways that we never expected. You know, I wrote a book several years ago, and the title of the book's Water to Wine. And in the book, I did not share my real feelings about this particular miracle. Because the reality is, if I were the Messiah, first off, I wouldn't have picked the 12 that he picked, but the next thing is this would not have been my first miracle. My first miracle would have been in front of thousands of people so that everyone could see my glory and that it would be something incredibly spectacular. But what happens here is unexpected, and it's unusual. Jesus' first miracle is in the corner of a kitchen at a wedding reception, and only about 15 people saw it. There were 12 of his apostles there. His mom's 13. There were a couple of servants. Maybe that's 15. Maybe more than that. Let's go up to 20. But the reality is that what was needed was done, and that Jesus did just the right thing at the right time in just the right moment in front of just the right audience. And his ministry started exactly the way that it needed to because he knew the impact of this miracle. This miracle had nothing to do with the people out there who would be drinking the wine, who would never even notice that he had done anything. It was about those 12 guys standing in front of him. He needed to deepen the devotion of his disciples before he moved the masses with his miracles. He needed to deepen their devotion, and at just the right time with just the right audience, that's exactly what he does. And it's funny how that seemingly awkward timing and that unusual method shows up in our lives as well. In the most unusual ways, at the most unusual times, God's awkward timing is just right. And the prophet Micah writes these words. He says, "But as for me, I will wait expectantly," or watch expectantly for the Lord. "I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me in the darkest moments." God's light shines brightest, and he can do better than we can in ways that we don't expect. Isaiah 55:8-9. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." He works in ways that we don't understand, in ways that are unusual, and they're ways that we never expect. And the way that we would work out our problem is not the way he works out his problem, and the way we would have handled this situation is not the way we would have handled this situation. You see, his thoughts are not our thoughts. And he has this way of doing better than we would ever do in ways that we would never expect him. Because he does better, we have a hope that he'll show up at times that we don't expect in ways that we don't expect. So not only did Jesus do better than we can in ways that we don't expect, also, when things go wrong, Jesus is drawing you close to him. I didn't say this in the first service, and I really meant to, so you pass this along to someone you know in the first service. This is the answer to the question. What can God do when things go wrong? What he does is he draws us closer to him. That's how he works in this scenario. It was what was happening at the wedding. What he was doing was these disciples, he was drawing them close to him. And just like it did in the wedding, he still does this today. Once again, the wedding guest had no idea that anything had happened behind the scenes at this wedding. It was just a real small audience, but it was the right audience. Because what he wanted to do was to deepen the devotion of these disciples. And in John chapter 2:11, the very last verse that we read in that story, it says this is the beginning of his signs he did Cana of Galilee. But look at that last phrase. And his disciples believed in him. See, this miracle meant everything to those disciples. And it was because of the superpower, but not the superpower of turning water into wine. It was the other superpower that I mentioned earlier. Their master had empathy. He was able to feel people's pain and predict their embarrassment, and he cared enough to do something about it, to bear their burdens. That he had this empathy that when he saw things that seemed ordinary and that other people may never notice, he still cared about those things, those mundane things that no one else may even recognize. It tells you that you don't have to be in a tragic situation in order for Jesus to care. He cares anyway. What you're going through may be unnoticed by friends, and how he reacts may be unnoticed by friends as he's trying to draw you closer. Or it may be something that only a few of your friends notice, but the reality is he's still there, and it leads us to a radical, no-holds-barred, extraordinary faith. And he reveals himself to us in ordinary stuff. That people are his ordinary tools, and this world is his ordinary workshop. And it doesn't have to be in one of those moments that's the wind and waves calming the sea moment or the raising Lazarus from the dead moment. It may be in that moment when you hold your child and they're sick, but you know they're going to get well. And you're amazed at the world that God has created around you. You see, it's in those dark moments that he reveals his glory. And if he draws us near, and this is the way he works, if Jesus cared about how people felt at a party, don't you think he cares about your life? Don't you think he cares about your unusual or mundane circumstances? Maybe the job you take, maybe the way you treat your friends, maybe the way you give back to God, maybe the way you share with others. See, he still uses simple things to reveal his glory, and he changes lives by revealing himself in those simple settings. And this is what I want you to really take away this morning. Jesus is an everyday God who is in your everyday life. He draws us near when we're having a terrible, horrible, no good, really bad day. And what he wants more than anything else is to reveal himself to you right now. If you're going through that valley, he wants you to know who he is, not just at Easter, just at Christmas, but in your everyday life. And if things are going wrong and you're going through that valley in your life, you may be there because he's trying to draw you closer. You see, that's what the cross was all about. We'll never have a horrible, terrible, no good, really bad day like Jesus did. And going to the cross was a grand gesture, but staying on the cross was where the power was at. Because it was the only way that we could be saved. It was the only way that he could do what he came to do. Hebrews chapter 9 says, and according to the law, one may almost say, all things are cleansed by blood, and without shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. And we should never forget in our deepest, darkest moments that whether we're having a good day, it's a good day, a bad day, it's a good day, because the cross, you see, we're only as clean as the cross was bloody. And he wants to reveal himself when things were going wrong. You know, at the wedding feast, it was not yet his time, but at the cross in Calvary, it was his time, and he did what he was supposed to do. And you know what? Someday will come when we draw our final breath and there's going to only be one thing that's important. How did you respond when you saw His glory? How did you respond when you saw Him in that everyday moment, in that ordinary circumstance in your life? Did you hear what He had to say and do what He said? You know, Jesus Himself said these words. In Mark 16:16 He says, "He who has believed and has been baptized shall be saved, and he who disbelieves shall be condemned." And when you look at those words, I want you to remember the words of His mother. As He had told her, "My time has not yet come," she looks at two servants and she says this, as I look at God's servants this morning: whatever He says to do, you do that.